So Common Cause is really about our motivational system. So we're looking at what are the values that sit at the heart of our motivational system and how does that result in terms of the attitudes and behaviours that we derive. It builds on some work that was done by a gentleman by the name of Professor Shalom Schwartz. And he was actually building on some work that was done in the, I think, the late 70s, early 80s by Herman Rokeach. And what Schwartz did is he basically took the common values that Rokeach had found and started to build them across a whole range of cultures and countries and look at what are the common values that sit across these different cultures and countries and plotted them. So he basically found that firstly, we all hold a whole range of common values. So there's about, I think, 58 values that was initially identified across 57 countries, and it's since been built into a much greater number. So he found that there's these common values, but also that the values have a relationship to each other. So what you see as sitting close together in terms of the dot mark are actually values that relate and reinforce and connect, and it follows also that those that are sitting further apart have an antagonistic relationship to each other. So Schwartz basically started looking at all of these common values that we have and looking at them in terms of the different clusters. So what we end up with is a cluster of 10 different segments identifying these different values. So if you start at the top, you've got universalism, which is very much around bigger than self. So all of these ones here are much more sort of bigger than self associated values. Universalism, benevolence, tradition, conformity, security, and then power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, and self-direction. So they're the 10 different segments. And there's also, you may well be familiar with these terms, intrinsic and extrinsic approaches. So one of the axes that actually runs across this chart is an intrinsic and extrinsic axis. So extrinsic values tend to be values that are more associated with concern for yourself and much more to do with things like status, social recognition, etc. So when I was working in advertising, for instance, we were really targeting these values essentially, even though we might not express it in the same way, but very much about looking for outward approval, those type of things. Intrinsic values, which come across here, are associated with concern for things bigger than self. So it might be your community, it might be other living things. It tends to be bigger than self issues and attitudes. And you will see in here, hopefully, you can read it okay, you'll see things like unity with nature, wisdom, true friendship, helpfulness, creativity, curiosity. So they are your more intrinsic values. So this circumflex starts to demonstrate the 10 different clusters. So you've got one of the axes here, which is the intrinsic extrinsic axis, and then you also have another axis which runs across here, which I won't talk too much about, but it's interesting to know because it refers to openness to change, and it's called conservation, but not in the environmental sense, but as in retaining the status quo, so conserving status. And when you start to think about this particular axis and what that means, and if you start to think about some of the public discussions that are happening, what's running in the public discourse, this axis actually comes into play quite a bit in terms of, one example is often what you'll hear through the media, what you might hear political leaders saying. So as we go through this, you can have a think about where some of those conversations are.